She was trapped, humiliated, and alone, until he stepped in. One man, one choice, and everything changed in an instant. Watch closely. This is the story of fear, courage, and a fight for freedom. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe if you love stories like this. I never thought the sound of a scream could split the air like that. Not the kind of scream children let out when they play, not the kind people give when they burn their hand on a stove. This one was different. It tore through the street sharp and raw, the kind that makes every muscle in your body turn cold before you even understand why. I had been walking with no particular rush, boots carrying me toward the smithy where a busted latch waited in my hands, when that scream cut through everything I knew to be ordinary. I stopped mid-step. Dust swirled at my boots, caught in the breathless silence that followed, and then came another sound, hoarse, choking, pulled too quickly into nothing. It was the sound of a soul being swallowed whole by fear. That was when I turned. Not because I was a man looking for trouble, but because trouble had already wrapped itself around someone else's throat, and I could feel it pressing into me as though it had chosen me, too. My eyes followed the narrow run between the feed store and the stables, a place where shadows pooled even in the heat of the day. People had gathered there. You could always tell when cruelty was unfolding by the way a crowd leaned in, half hungry, half ashamed, none of them close enough to touch the guilt of it, yet none willing to walk away. My stomach tightened. I pushed through them. The sight that met me is one I will never forget. She was sitting on a stool, thin as wire, cheeks smeared with soot as if someone had dragged her face through the ashes of their own hatred. One hand clutched the seat as though it might keep her from drowning. The other was twisted cruelly behind her by a man who held her not with care but with ownership. Her gaze was fixed on the ground. I knew that look. I had seen it in men cornered by war, in animals pushed beyond mercy. It was the look of someone who believed that looking up might invite more pain than they could bear. Beside her stood a woman whose eyes were sharper than the blades she held. She was older, jaw set like iron, shoulders broad from a life of ruling her household with fists and words alike. In her hand, the shears flashed once in the sun before they sank into a lock of the girl's auburn hair. It fell, dull against the dirt, lifeless. Another lock followed, then another, each one falling with a finality that struck harder than a gunshot. The older woman's voice lashed the air, carrying words chosen to cut deeper than the steel she wielded. Shameful, lazy, worthless. She wanted the crowd to hear, wanted her cruelty to be remembered in echoes that would follow the girl for years. That was her justice, her law. Something moved inside me then. Not anger, not yet. Anger burns hot and blind. This was colder, heavier. It was the weight that comes when you've lived long enough to know the silence of a crowd is as dangerous as any weapon. I stepped forward. My boots ground against the grit, and the murmurs fell away until the only sound left was the rasp of steel closing over hair. My shadow fell across them. The shears froze mid-cut, and the older woman looked up. Her eyes narrowed, measuring me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I told her the girl was leaving with me. The crowd laughed in uncertain spurts, the kind of laugh that comes when people are torn between fear and entertainment. The man holding her tightened his grip. His stance changed, trying to look casual, but I could see his fingers digging into her arm like he wanted to bruise her spirit into silence. The girl didn't move, not at first. Why would she? A lifetime of cruelty teaches you that no hand reaches out to save you without demanding a price later. Still, I kept my eyes on her, steady, plain, not asking, not commanding, just telling her there was another road. Slowly, she lifted her head. When her eyes met mine, I saw a hollow where trust should have lived. I saw a woman who had been told one too many times that she belonged to someone else. The man at her side twitched. His free hand brushed against the revolver at his hip. I closed the space between us in 3 steps, laid my hand on his shoulder. Not hard, not yet. Just enough weight to remind him I had carried cattle heavier than him, and I had never let them move where they weren't meant to. His stance faltered. I repeated myself. She was leaving with me. The shears clanged into a bucket, tossed aside by the older woman with a scoff. Her voice spat venom, declaring that the girl was theirs by law, bound through marriage, tied to them by duty stronger than chains. My jaw tightened, but I let silence stretch until it grew too heavy for even the cruel to carry. Then I told her, not any more. I pulled my neckerchief loose, the cloth softened by years under sun, and placed it over the girl's shoulders. It was a small gesture, maybe, but I knew what it meant. In front of that crowd, I covered her, gave her back a sliver of dignity they had stripped away strand by strand. She rose slowly, unsteady, her knees trembling like dry grass in the wind. But she rose. We walked through the crowd. Boots scraped against the dirt. Whispers chased our steps, but I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew they were watching, knew their hunger had turned to something else now. Fear, maybe, or disbelief. The girl's weight beside me felt fragile, like the air might break her if I let go. Still, I kept close, my hand hovering near enough to catch her if she stumbled. The heat outside hit us like a wall, but even that felt better than the darkness we had left behind. By the time we reached my horse, she stopped short. The saddle loomed too high, too far. I didn't ask permission. I lifted her, light as a sack of grain, and set her in the saddle before climbing up behind her. Her spine was stiff as wood, every part of her braced for something she couldn't yet name. My arm came around to take the reins. Together, we rode away from the murmurs, away from the blades, away from the people who had decided she was theirs to break. I knew it wasn't finished. The road behind us was long, and I could feel the weight of unseen eyes still pressing against my back. But for the first time in what might have been years, she was no longer theirs. The night bled into silence after the last scream. Eli Mercer stood frozen, his boots rooted in the dirt path as if the earth itself held him captive. That scream was not the cry of a woman being startled. It carried pain, old pain, ancestral pain, and in its brokenness there was a warning. He turned slowly, his hand brushing the handle of the knife on his belt. The ranch had always been a quiet place. Coyotes sang at dusk, and owls kept their lonely vigil in the trees. But this was no natural sound of the land. He thought of the woman, the one who had just been dragged away by her in-laws, her hair shorn in violence, her face blackened by soot. He had only seen her once before, when she arrived with her new husband, her eyes bright with a hope that had already begun to dim. Eli had learned long ago that other people's troubles were dangerous waters to wade into. A man could drown in them before he even knew how deep the current ran. But something in that scream would not let him walk away. He followed the sound. The dirt road narrowed into a crooked path between the barns. A lantern flickered ahead, shadows moving violently against the wooden walls. He heard shouting now, male voices, rough and careless, like cattle prodded into rage. Then another noise, a muffled sob, swallowed into the dry air. Eli paused at the corner of the barn, his breath shallow. He thought of his father, a man who had once told him, "Mercers don't meddle. You save your skin first, boy, and let others save theirs." His father had died with those words in his mouth, cut down in a feud that wasn't his to fight. And yet here Eli stood, his own blood humming with the same reckless pull. He stepped into the lantern's glow. The woman was on her knees, her face streaked with ash and tears. 2 men, her husband's brothers, if Eli remembered right, stood over her. One clutched a rope in his hand as if he meant to leash her like a stray. The other pressed her head down, forcing her into the dirt. "Enough," Eli said, his voice carrying more steel than he felt. The men spun around. Surprise cracked across their faces before anger quickly followed. "This ain't your business, Mercer," the taller one growled. "Go on back to your cows." Eli's jaw tightened. When a woman screams like that, it becomes everyone's business. The shorter brother laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "You planning to be her savior? Careful, rancher. Men who play hero often end up dead." Eli's hand closed around the knife at his belt. He didn't draw it yet, but the weight was steadying. His heart pounded hard enough that he could feel it in his throat. He glanced at the woman. Her eyes, wide and raw with fear, locked on his. There was no plea in them, only a silent recognition, like she already knew what kind of man he was, or what kind of man he might become if he stepped forward. "You got two choices," Eli said evenly. "Let her go and walk away, or stay and see how far you're willing to bleed for this cruelty." The taller brother sneered. "You think you scare us? We've broken tougher men than you." The rope tightened in his grip. The woman whimpered. Eli finally drew the knife. The lantern light flashed across its edge, silver and cold. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The night held its breath. Even the crickets seemed to fall silent, as if waiting to see who would step first into violence. The shorter brother lunged. Eli sidestepped, his arm swinging in a blur. The knife kissed flesh, shallow but sharp enough to send blood running down the man's sleeve. He cursed and stumbled back. The taller one charged with a roar. Eli braced himself, the ground trembling beneath heavy boots. But before the man could reach him, the woman lashed upward, her hand snatching the rope from his grip. She yanked with all the fury of the humiliated, wrapping the rope around his arm, pulling him off balance. Eli seized the moment. He slammed his shoulder into the man's chest, driving him into the barn wall. The impact rattled the boards and shook loose a shower of dust. The fight was short, brutal, and clumsy. Eli was not a soldier. He was a rancher. But survival had taught him to strike quick and without hesitation. When both brothers finally staggered back, one bleeding and the other gasping for air, Eli stood between them and the woman, knife still raised. "Try again," he said, his voice low. "I'll make sure you don't walk away this time." The taller brother spat blood onto the dirt. His eyes burned with rage, but he must have seen something in Eli's stance, something that told him the rancher wasn't bluffing. He grabbed his injured brother, muttering curses under his breath, and together they retreated into the shadows. Eli turned. The woman was still on her knees, the rope coiled in her hands. Her breath came in short, shuddering bursts. For a long moment they just stared at each other, strangers bound now by violence. "You're safe for now," Eli said quietly. But even as he spoke, he knew the truth. This was far from over. The morning after the screams, the valley seemed too quiet, as though the land itself was holding its breath. The rancher, still stiff from the restless night, woke to the low creak of the windmill turning and the muted shuffle of hooves in the corral. He sat on the edge of his cot, boots dangling, listening. It was not the ordinary silence of dawn. It was the strained silence of a wound not yet closed, a silence carrying questions no one dared to ask. The woman he had brought from her in-laws' house lay curled on the opposite cot, her hair jagged where it had been shorn, her face streaked with bruises. He had placed a wool blanket over her shoulders the night before, but she had not touched the bread or the water he left on the small table. She did not stir when he rose. For a moment he thought she might still be asleep, but then he noticed her eyes, faintly open, staring into nothing. He cleared his throat. "There's work to do in the fields. I'll be gone a while. You'll be safe here." No answer. He stood there longer than he meant to, as though waiting for her voice. Finally, he turned, pushing open the door. The chill of the air cut at him sharper than any blade. In town, whispers had begun. People noticed when a man rode home with another man's daughter-in-law. They noticed when she did not return. At the blacksmith's shop, the hammer paused mid-swing as the rancher stepped inside. "You were late yesterday," the blacksmith said, but his eyes narrowed with a curiosity that words did not carry. "Gate hinge broke," the rancher replied flatly. The blacksmith nodded, though the truth of the matter was not in the hinge, but in the screams that half the valley had heard. The rancher felt the weight of those unspoken words press against his back as he collected the repaired iron and left. He rode home faster than usual, a pulse of unease in his chest. When he returned, the woman was sitting by the window. She had not eaten, but her posture was different now. Upright, alert, her hands folded in her lap like a figure carved from stone. She did not look at him when he entered. "You can leave if you want," he said quietly. "I won't stop you." Her voice, when it came, was raw and low. "If I leave, they'll find me. And when they do, they'll bury me before sundown." The rancher's jaw tightened. He had known this truth, though hearing it aloud pressed something deeper into him, something like guilt. He thought of her face in the dim light, of the silence that had stretched between them through the night. "I didn't bring you here to hide," he said. "I brought you here to live." She laughed then, a hollow sound, too sharp to belong to joy. "Live? Out here, in a shack on the edge of the valley? That's not living. That's waiting to be hunted." The word stung, though he did not show it. Instead, he moved to the cupboard, taking down a jar of dried beans, setting them on the counter. His hands worked the tasks of cooking, but his mind tangled itself around her voice, her despair. As dusk settled, a rider approached the ranch. The woman stiffened when she heard the distant thunder of hooves. She moved toward the door, but the rancher raised a hand. "Stay inside." He stepped out, shotgun resting against his shoulder. The rider slowed near the fence, a dust cloud following him. It was Eli Mercer's cousin, a lean man with sharp eyes and sharper words. "Heard some noise last night," the cousin said, tipping his hat. "Sounded like trouble." The rancher's grip on the gun tightened. "Wind carries strange. Strange enough to sound like a woman screaming?" For a moment, the air thickened between them. Coyotes howled faintly in the distance. The rancher said nothing. The cousin leaned forward in his saddle, voice dropping. "If she's with you, you better think twice. Folks won't forgive a man stealing what isn't his. Blood's been spilled for less." The rancher's eyes flicked to the cabin window, where the shadow of the woman lingered, then back to the cousin. His voice was steady, but steel-lined. "Ride home." The cousin smirked, as though satisfied by the tension he had drawn. He tugged the reins, turning his horse back toward the valley. "This ain't finished," he called over his shoulder. The rancher watched him go, the twilight swallowing his figure. He stood in the dust until the last echo of hooves faded, then lowered the shotgun, breath heavy. Inside, the woman looked at him with something that was not quite gratitude, not quite fear. "They'll come again," she whispered. "I know," he answered. Her eyes, swollen but fierce, fixed on him. "Then you'll have to decide if I'm worth the war that follows." The silence that came after was heavier than any scream, heavier than the night itself. It sat between them like a loaded weapon, waiting to be fired. That night, as the moon cast its pale light across the valley, the rancher lay awake, listening for every sound, every shift in the dark. Outside, the world felt poised, like the moment before a storm breaks. Inside, a truth settled in him, unwelcome, unyielding. He had not only taken her from them. He had taken the path that would decide both their fates. And the valley was watching. The day broke with a brittle chill, the kind that felt sharper than it should, slicing through the thin layers of flannel and wool. I watched her from the doorway as she moved about the cabin, her motions hesitant but deliberate, like someone learning to walk on unsteady ground after a long fall. Each movement carried the weight of her past. Every glance at the floor, every brush of her fingers along the counter spoke of memories she wished could be scrubbed away. I kept myself busy outside, mending the fence along the eastern pasture, but my eyes never strayed far. The rhythm of hammer against post was soothing, almost meditative, yet the tension in the pit of my stomach never eased. I had brought her here to safety, yet safety is a fragile thing, fragile as frost on the morning grass, and every shadow in the valley felt like it carried a threat. By late morning, she had ventured a little further into the yard, sweeping the porch with a broom that seemed too large in her thin hands. The scratches on her arms, remnants of rough hands and harsher words, were fading slowly under the pale sunlight, yet they were not the only marks left upon her. There were deeper ones, invisible to anyone but those who knew where to look. The tight curl of her shoulders, the lowered tilt of her chin, the way her eyes darted toward every distant sound. I called her over when the work in the field was done. "Sit," I said, gesturing toward the bench by the porch. My voice was neutral, unhurried, but the command carried the weight of someone used to being obeyed. She hesitated, then slowly lowered herself, hands clasped tight in her lap. "You don't have to speak if you don't want," I said. "I just need to know you're breathing." Her gaze lifted briefly, meeting mine for a fraction of a heartbeat before dropping again. "I've learned that breathing is the easiest thing to take away," she murmured, voice raw, almost swallowed by the wind. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, worn notebook, its edges frayed, pages yellowed with age. I had kept it for years, scribbling notes on livestock, weather patterns, and the occasional observation about people. I handed it to her. "Write if you must. Don't speak. Just write." Her fingers trembled as she took it, the weight unfamiliar. She flipped through the pages, as if discovering a new language, before setting it on her lap. For a long moment, silence stretched over the cabin, broken only by the faint rustle of wind through the junipers and the soft cluck of hens. By afternoon, I noticed a change. She was moving with more confidence, brushing dust from the floor, organizing the kitchen shelves, even humming a tune too faint to recognize. The small, subtle progress made me wonder if perhaps the valley itself had a hand in it, if the open sky, the endless stretch of sage and grass, could stitch back what had been torn apart in town. But the peace was fragile. Shadows from the ridge lingered, and every distant rumble of hooves, every flash of movement against the horizon, made her stiffen. She had been broken, yes, but not blind to the dangers that could still descend upon us. That evening, I took her out beyond the cabin, to the creek that cut a narrow path through the dry grass. The water was cold, moving with a rhythm older than any living thing. I knelt, letting the basin catch the water, and gestured for her to approach. She hesitated at first, but then stepped forward, hands brushing the surface of the liquid, feeling the cool bite against her palms. "The world hasn't ended," I said quietly, more to myself than to her. "And it hasn't forgotten kindness." She looked at me then, fully this time, her eyes wide and searching. A flicker of something, reluctant trust, perhaps, or the faintest spark of hope, shone in them. "I don't know if I can believe that," she admitted. "You don't have to believe right away," I replied. "Just act as if you can. Sometimes, that's enough." The night fell slowly, blanketing the valley in shadows deeper than any I had seen before. Stars emerged, fragile pinpricks of light, yet even they seemed distant, unable to pierce the weight of what had transpired in the town. I stoked the fire, letting the flames lick at the cold air, and she sat across from me, shoulders still tight, but breathing more evenly than she had in days. A distant howl broke the night, faint but unmistakable. Her fingers twitched at the sound, gripping the notebook as though it were armor. I didn't speak. Some battles cannot be quelled with words. They must be endured, each moment of tension, each heartbeat a measure of patience and strength. Hours passed in quiet. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain from the west, dampening the earth, making the grass smell of soil and storm. She finally leaned back, the tension in her shoulders loosening just slightly. "Tomorrow," she said softly, "I'll try to do more." "Good," I said. "We'll take it slow, step by step. No one's chasing the sunrise, and neither are we." I watched her settle for the night, her eyes finally closing, the notebook resting against her chest like a shield. Outside, the valley held its breath again, waiting for the storm that was coming, not of wind or rain, but of the people who would not relinquish what they believed was theirs. I felt the weight of what was coming, pressing down on the small cabin, the quiet creek, the thin walls that separated safety from chaos. And yet, for the first time since I had pulled her from that house, I allowed myself a thought I hadn't dared before. Perhaps, just perhaps, we could endure it. The fire crackled, shadows dancing across the walls, and the night whispered promises of both danger and resilience. And I knew, in that quiet, that the valley was not just a place. It was a crucible, and in its heat, we would either be forged stronger, or broken completely. The morning broke grey, the kind of grey that made the valley feel suspended between dream and waking. Fog curled along the edges of the creek, and every fence post, every juniper, seemed shrouded in a silent warning. I had risen early, as always, boots crunching on frost-kissed grass, the rifle slung loosely over my shoulder. The cabin remained quiet behind me, but the air carried the tension of 100 unspoken threats. She emerged on the porch just as the sun cast its first hesitant light over the ridge. Her hair, still uneven from the cruel scissors of the past, fell over her shoulders in soft, unkempt waves. The borrowed flannel shirt hung loosely over her frame, the sleeves long and too wide, but it seemed to give her some measure of comfort. She moved with a stiffness that had yet to fade, but each motion was steadier than the day before. I gestured for her to stay behind as I scanned the valley. The horizon was empty, yet the weight of expectation pressed upon us both. The in-laws would not have rested. I knew that. They would have tracked us, questioned neighbors, perhaps even stirred up trouble from the town we had left behind. And while we were distant, distance had never been a guarantee. By mid-morning, the sound came. Faint at first, the rhythmic thud of hooves striking wet earth, growing sharper, more deliberate. My chest tightened, the old instincts surfacing, those I had honed long before I had even considered involving myself in someone else's troubles. I motioned for her to step back, crouched low behind the ridge that bordered the creek, and waited. The figures emerged from the fog, 4 riders, their presence deliberate, calculated. Even from a distance, I could read their intent. This was not a casual visit. The mother-in-law sat rigid in the wagon, skirts whipping in the wind, eyes like cold steel. Her sons flanked her, one broad and imposing, the other narrow and quick, both exuding a dangerous impatience. And at the rear, a man from town whose smile had always carried a threat instead of warmth. I kept my posture low, rifle resting against my shoulder, every muscle coiled and ready. I could feel her behind me, tense, silent, gripping the rail of the porch. Her breath came shallow, but steady. She had learned that fear was manageable when faced with preparation, and she had begun to trust the quiet promise of my presence. The wagon stopped short of the fence, wheels sinking slightly into the mud. The mother-in-law rose, voice sharp enough to cut through the fog. "You've taken what belongs to me," she called. "Return her now, or face the consequences." I did not answer immediately. I let the silence stretch, letting it press against them like the fog itself. Words could be weapons, but so could absence, and patience could be sharper than a knife in the right hands. "You think hiding her here changes anything?" the broad sun spat. "Law is on our side. She is ours by marriage." I lifted my gaze slowly, meeting the eyes of the mother-in-law without fear. "She is not property," I said, "and no law you claim grants you ownership over another human being. Step off my land, or we settle this differently." The narrow sun shifted, hand brushing the butt of his revolver. I did not flinch. Years of handling cattle, moving heavy loads, negotiating with men far more dangerous than these had taught me that threats were only as strong as the fear they could instill, and fear was a choice. A gust of wind swept through the valley, carrying the scent of wet earth and rain. I could hear her inhale sharply behind me, her fingers tightening around the edge of the porch. I did not look at her, but I could feel the tension in her spine, the way her body read the danger as instinctively as mine. The mother-in-law leaned forward in the wagon, eyes narrowing. "You cannot hide her from us forever. She is ours by right, and we will not leave until she is returned." I stepped forward slightly, letting the rifle hang steady but loaded. My shadow stretched long across the muddy ground, a silent assertion of the space I claimed. "She is under my protection now," I said. "And protection is not negotiable." The broad sun laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that grated against the air. "Protection? From what?" "You. You're alone out here. The law is behind us, and you're just one man." I adjusted my stance, the rifle pressing slightly more firmly against my shoulder. "One man, yes. But I am not alone. The law is not the only measure of rightness. And if you cross this fence, you'll learn just how determined I can be." They shifted, uncertain, eyes flicking between each other, the mother-in-law, and the unyielding line of land that separated us. The fog swirled, masking intentions, concealing distance, but it could not hide the resolve set into my posture, nor the silent bond of trust one had forged with the woman behind me. For a long moment, the valley held its breath. Hooves sank into mud, the wagon creaked under tension, and the rain began to patter softly, a whispering drumbeat across the ridge. I knew they were calculating. They would not leave easily. And tomorrow, when the sun rose again, they would return with more certainty, more aggression. But for now, the standoff held, a fragile pause in the storm, a reminder that courage, when steady, could push back even the most determined force. Behind me, she exhaled slowly, as if releasing the weight she had been carrying for weeks. Her fingers unclenched, brushing against the notebook she had tucked under her arm. Perhaps she began to understand that protection, real protection, required more than words. It required readiness, presence, and a willingness to confront the world together, no matter the cost. And so we waited, the valley and its shadows standing witness, knowing that the next move would define everything: freedom, dignity, and the fragile beginnings of trust that neither of us could afford to lose. The morning mist had barely lifted when they struck. I could hear it before I saw it, the rhythmic pounding of hooves tearing through the damp soil, boots crunching over frost-crusted grass, the clatter of wagon wheels dragging unevenly behind. My heart hammered, not from fear, but from a surge of readiness I hadn't felt in years. Behind me, she remained close, a shadow in the fog, her eyes wide and alert, muscles tense beneath the borrowed flannel. They came in force, for mounted figures and the wagon, a moving wall of intent and authority. The mother-in-law sat in the wagon like a queen claiming her prize, skirts snapping in the wind, hands gripping the edges of the canvas. Her sons flanked her, broad and narrow, eyes sharp and unyielding, and the town man lingered at the rear, his grin sour, full of unspoken malice. I stepped forward, rifle leveled but not yet raised. My voice carried over the distance, even as the fog thickened around us. "This ends here," I said, steady, deliberate. "Step back, or you cross into a place where law cannot protect you." The broad sun sneered, leaning forward in his saddle. "Law is on our side, and you're standing alone. She belongs to us by marriage. Hand her over, and no one gets hurt." I shook my head slowly, every muscle coiled and ready. "She belongs to herself, and as long as I stand here, she stays free." They hesitated for a heartbeat, uncertainty flickering across their faces. Then the narrow sun moved, revolver raised, eyes calculating the distance between us. My grip tightened on the rifle, but I did not flinch. Years of experience had taught me that fear was a weapon that only worked when the target allowed it. The first move came from the mother-in-law. She shoved a long pole forward, attempting to strike from the wagon, but I was faster. I ducked low, letting her swing pass harmlessly above me, and in the same motion I advanced a few steps. My shadow stretched over the frozen grass, a silent warning. She flinched behind me, but I kept my gaze fixed on them. "Stay down," I murmured low, enough for her to hear but not the intruders. Her hands clutched the porch railing until her knuckles were white, but she did not move from behind my line. The broad sun tried to charge, spurring his horse forward. The narrow one followed, revolver ready, intent clear. I fired a warning shot into the earth between them, the report echoing like a clap of thunder over the valley. Both horses shied, hooves sliding in mud, giving me a fraction of a second to assess the next move. The town man dismounted, boots sinking into wet soil, eyes fixed on her. I did not hesitate. I stepped directly between them, rifle pressed lightly against my shoulder, voice low and controlled. "Back. Now." They laughed, short and bitter, but the laughter carried a hesitation that hadn't been there before. The mother-in-law leaned forward again, lips curling in disgust, hands reaching as though she could snatch the moment from my grip. I could see her rage bubbling beneath the surface, a storm waiting to break. Time slowed. The mist swirled, the world condensing into the immediate clash of intention, the raw force of a confrontation neither side could avoid. The broad sun swung a fist. I caught it mid-motion, twisting it with the precision of muscle memory honed over years of labor and confrontation. His shock gave me the split second I needed to press forward. The narrow sun fired a shot, but the angle was wrong, the recoil jolting his aim wide. Mud and gravel flew, spraying the ground between us, as I advanced, each step deliberate, every muscle tuned to action. She stayed behind me, silent, tense, yet somehow unafraid because I had placed myself as a shield between her and the world that had sought to destroy her. The mother-in-law shrieked, a sound that could cut through bone, anger and disbelief fused into a single note. She rose fully in the wagon, hand raised again, this time gripping the reins with intent to charge. But the horses hesitated, sensing the tension in their riders, the unpredictability of my movement. For a moment we all froze, the valley holding its breath as the fog and rain mingled, the wet earth clinging to boots and hooves alike. I could feel the rhythm of her breathing behind me, the subtle shift as she moved slightly closer, seeking reassurance, safety, which I offered in the only way possible. Presence, vigilance, readiness to act with unflinching resolve. The town man attempted to circle, looking for an opening, but I anticipated the move, pivoting, keeping my shadow between him and her. Each step I took was calculated, minimal, deliberate. I was not just defending space. I was asserting that she was no longer a pawn in the games of others, that her freedom was defended by more than words. It was defended by action. Then, the mother-in-law's rage broke through reason. She hurled the reins forward, attempting to topple the wagon onto me. I dove sideways, mud spraying across my sleeves, and pressed forward again, closing the distance between us. The sons faltered, surprised by the audacity of my movement, the precision of timing that left them reacting instead of dictating. Behind me, she whispered something, barely audible, but the meaning was clear. She trusted me. She believed, in the smallest, most fragile way, that we could survive this encounter together. And that knowledge bolstered my determination. The standoff lasted minutes that felt like hours, the fog thickening, the rain falling steadily, mud sucking at boots. Yet, with each measured movement, each deliberate advance, the intruders began to retreat, uncertainty creeping into their eyes. The mother-in-law's screeching voice faltered, the sons exchanged tense glances, and the town man's grin vanished, replaced by the cautious calculation of a man realizing he had misjudged the resolve of his opposition. By the time the fog thinned, the confrontation had shifted. They had retreated, dragging the wagon through the mud, hooves splashing, curses muttered under breath. My boots sank in the wet soil as I exhaled, the tension leaving my body in slow waves. Behind me, she emerged from her hiding, tentative steps bringing her closer. Her gaze met mine, a fragile acknowledgement of survival, of a bond forged not through words, but through the shared crucible of danger. We stood there in the valley, rain falling in steady sheets, the fog beginning to lift, revealing the scarred ground where intention had clashed. The confrontation was over for now, but the knowledge remained. They would return, stronger, more determined. Yet so would I, and this time she would not be alone in facing them. The rain had softened to a steady drizzle by the time we returned to the cabin. The valley had been cleared of intruders, but the mud-slicked path and the distant echo of hooves reminded me that the danger had only paused, not vanished. She walked close behind me, careful steps matching the rhythm of my own, her borrowed flannel damp and heavy against her skin. I didn't speak, not immediately. Words felt unnecessary. The presence of solid bodies against the wet chill was enough to anchor us both. Inside the cabin, the warmth from the stove wrapped around us like a protective cloak. Steam curled lazily from a pot I had left to boil before the confrontation, mingling with the faint smell of pine smoke that lingered in the corners. She moved cautiously, surveying each surface as if she were rediscovering space that had once been familiar but had felt alien in the hands of others. Every table, every chair, every corner of the worn wood floor became a marker of safety. I set the pot on the stove, tilting it slightly so that the water lapped softly against the rim. "Sit," I said, nodding toward the bench. Her hands lingered at the edge for a moment before she lowered herself, the weight of exhaustion settling on her shoulders. I could feel her tension in the way her fingers flexed against her knees, knuckles pale and rigid. She hadn't spoken since the valley, yet the quiet between us was not uncomfortable. It was a shared rhythm, an acknowledgement that survival had come through action rather than conversation. The fire sputtered, sending small sparks curling into the air, and I moved to fetch a tin cup. Pouring the water carefully, I handed it to her without a word. Her fingers wrapped around it, trembling slightly, and she lifted it to her lips. The warmth seeped into her, and I could see her posture soften imperceptibly. It was a small victory, but one worth noting. Hours passed in the muted company of the storm. Rain hammered against the roof in steady rhythm, wind tugging at shutters that had long lost their tightness. She remained at the bench, occasionally glancing out the window as if expecting a shadow to appear in the mist. I didn't force words, didn't insist on conversation. Instead, I moved quietly around the cabin, tending the fire, checking the rifle, adjusting the water kettle, each movement deliberate, each action a silent affirmation that the space was safe, that the storm outside could not reach us within these walls. By mid-afternoon, the rain softened further, the heavy sheets turning into a gentle patter. She rose, tentative at first, and moved to the small garden plot we had cleared earlier. Her hands, though delicate, were steady as she began turning the soil, the familiar motion of work grounding her. It struck me then how much of this freedom, this peace, was rooted not in words or promises, but in simple, tangible tasks, an act of cultivation in a world that had tried to strip her of agency. I watched her from the doorway, leaning against the frame. The sun had broken through the thinning clouds, casting a soft, diffused light over the valley. Every movement she made, every step in the dirt, was measured and careful, but there was a spark in her eyes that hadn't been there when I first brought her here. It was faint, but unmistakable, a whisper of trust beginning to bloom amidst the remnants of fear. Dinner that evening was quiet. I set 2 plates on the table, a simple meal of beans and cornbread, thick and warm. She ate slowly, savoring each bite as though tasting not just food, but a restoration of dignity, a reclaiming of something once denied. I watched, saying nothing, letting the silence carry the weight of understanding between us. Afterwards, I retrieved the small jar of salve, placing it carefully beside her. Her fingers closed around it, hesitant, and then she opened the lid, the scent of pine resin sharp and clean. She applied it to her arms and hands with methodical care, each motion a ritual of reclaiming, of healing. I stayed close but did not intrude, aware that space could be as protective as the walls themselves. Night came, folding the cabin into darkness, broken only by the lamplight spilling across the floor. She lingered in the doorway for a long moment before settling into the narrow bedroom, the borrowed flannel wrapped around her shoulders. I watched from the common room, checking the rifle, making sure everything was in order. I could hear her breathing slow, even out, the faint creak of the bed beneath her signaling that she had finally begun to relax. The storm outside was relentless, but softened by distance. Somewhere in the valley, a coyote called, echoing across the wet landscape. I felt the weight of the valley pressing in, the storm's rhythm in sync with our shared heartbeat. She was safe for now, and as I sat in the dim lamplight, the rifle across my knees, I realized that trust, fragile as it was, had begun to take root. By morning, the world had changed subtly. The rain had ceased, leaving the valley washed clean, the soil dark and rich, the air sharp with the scent of renewal. She moved with more purpose, sweeping the porch, attending to chores without hesitation, and I observed, noting the subtle transformations. Each act of independence, each motion that reflected her growing confidence, was a step toward reclaiming not just safety, but self. That day, as the sun climbed higher, we stood side by side on the porch. She reached for the watering bucket without my prompting, eyes fixed on the plants, hands steady and deliberate. I did not intervene, did not speak. Instead, I let her actions speak for themselves. The bond between us had shifted, from a fragile thread of dependency to a mutual understanding, silent, unspoken, but undeniable. By evening, we shared the porch again, watching the sun dip behind the distant ridge. The valley stretched before us, washed in gold, the storm a memory fading into soft mist. She spoke then, her voice quiet, almost hesitant. Not words of fear, but a reflection of thought, a trace of reflection that had been impossible in the days before. I listened, nodding occasionally, but mostly I allowed the silence to hold us, to let the unspoken acknowledgement pass between us, that the world outside had not broken her, that trust could grow, and that together we could endure what lay ahead. The night settled in, stars beginning to prick the dark sky. She slept finally, breathing even, a fragile peace held in the steady rhythm of the cabin. I remained awake, checking the doors, the rifle, the small windows. Every shadow outside could not touch what we had created here, and somewhere deep in the quiet, I felt the first real certainty, that this place, this sanctuary, had begun to heal more than just her wounds. It had begun to heal something in me as well. The morning mist had barely lifted when the first signs of trouble appeared. I noticed them as a flicker of movement on the ridge beyond the valley, silhouettes that did not belong to any wildlife we were familiar with. At first, I dismissed it as a trick of the fog, but the sound followed, a faint, deliberate crunch of boots against the wet earth. My hand instinctively went to the rifle, fingers brushing the worn wood, knuckles tightening. She emerged from the cabin doorway, flannel damp but dry enough from the morning sun. Her eyes caught mine, a question unspoken, and I simply nodded. There was no need to speak. Survival had taught us to communicate in glances, in gestures, in the unvoiced rhythm of understanding. She didn't flinch. Instead, she adjusted the strap of the small pack I had prepared for emergencies, moving with a deliberate grace that spoke of both readiness and trust. The ridge was alive now with movement, at least a half-dozen figures, circling carefully as though aware of the terrain's dangers. I recognized some of the patterns from earlier, men who knew the land, using the fog as cover, moving with the precision of hunters who had stalked before. It wasn't random. This was intentional, a second wave, more coordinated than the first. "Inside," I whispered, guiding her back to the cabin, the rifle now loaded with deliberate care. She obeyed, not with hesitation, but with a focused alertness, crouching low as I checked the windows and reinforced the shutters. Every creak of the old wood echoed in the tense air, but we moved methodically, preparing not for flight but for confrontation. The valley, once a silent backdrop to our survival, now seemed a living entity, alert to our every move, listening to our quiet strategy. Hours passed as we observed them from behind reinforced panels. They circled, probing, testing, sending faint signals to one another across the misted valley. I noted their positions, memorized the intervals, and planned accordingly. She sat nearby, silent, hands folded over her knees, occasionally tracing a line in the dust of the floorboards. Her presence was both steadying and urgent, a reminder that while I could strategize, we were in this together. By late afternoon, their probing escalated. One figure broke from the ridge, advancing carefully down a shallow gully. My finger hovered over the trigger, breath steady, heart measured. I could feel her tensing beside me, the faint scrape of her boots against the cabin floor, a subtle echo of fear transformed into resolve. She didn't need reassurance. She had begun to understand instinctively when to act, when to wait, when to rely on the silent dialogue we had cultivated through shared danger. I exhaled slowly, shifting the rifle just enough to keep the approaching figure in sight. Then, without warning, he veered slightly off course, signaling to the others. The circle was closing, faster now, their awareness sharpened by experience. We had mere moments to act, or risk losing the advantage that the valley's natural barriers had granted us. "Follow my lead," I whispered, and she responded with a subtle nod, tightening the pack strap and moving toward the back exit, the one path that led through dense underbrush. It wasn't an escape. It was a tactical repositioning. Every step was deliberate, every movement measured against the rhythm of the pursuers. We slipped into the woods, moving low, shadows among shadows. The men on the ridge were momentarily distracted by the cabin's empty semblance, giving us a fleeting advantage. Branches snapped underfoot, but the thick carpet of leaves muffled much of our passage. I glanced back once, catching her eyes in the fleeting light, and saw not fear, but a fierce focus. She had transformed from prey to partner, her instincts sharpened, her mind quick. The pursuit was relentless. They adapted, fanning out into a tighter formation, voices carried faintly through the mist, issuing orders in sharp tones. But we had the advantage of terrain and preparation. I led her toward a narrow ravine, the undergrowth dense enough to slow them, the descent steep enough to provide cover. Every step was calculated, every heartbeat synchronized with the faint pulse of the forest. By the time we reached the shallow creek, the sound of our pursuers was behind us, growing more chaotic as they struggled to navigate the underbrush. I paused, crouching low, eyes scanning the tree line. She mirrored my movements, holding the pack close, breathing shallow, ready. The creek offered a temporary barrier, but not safety. It was a pause, a moment to reassess, to plan the next move. "Listen," I whispered, fingers tracing the faint indentation of a hidden trail I had discovered months earlier. "We can circle back, force them into the marshlands. They know the valley, but not the forest paths like we do." She nodded, silent agreement passing between us. Every decision now was survival tempered with strategy, trust and instinct intertwined. Night fell, heavy and thick, as we moved along the concealed path. The moon was obscured by clouds, the forest alive with unseen eyes and distant cries. Every shadow could hide an adversary, every sound could signal an attack. Yet despite the danger, there was a rhythm in our movements, a tacit understanding. We were no longer merely defending. We were orchestrating, turning the chase into a counterplay, forcing our pursuers to act blindly, to expend energy while we conserved ours. By midnight, we reached the marshlands, the ground soft and treacherous. Here, the forest gave us the upper hand. The thick mud and tangled roots were hazards we could navigate, but to our pursuers, they were traps. I led her through carefully, step by step, watching her movements, seeing how her confidence had grown. She was no longer fragile, no longer passive. She was a participant in our survival, capable, aware, and unyielding. The first of them entered the marsh, boots sinking, movements slowed. I whispered, "Now," and she pressed close, silent but ready, her hands steady. We had transformed the environment into our ally, turning the chase into a crucible. Every step they took was disadvantageous, every advance uncertain. The night stretched long, shadows shifting, the fog thickening. Yet in the midst of this, a sense of rhythm had emerged, a cadence of pursuit and counter, fear and control, instinct and strategy. We were no longer hunted. We were orchestrators of our own defense, moving with precision, trust, and a quiet ferocity that mirrored the storm that had once raged around the cabin. And somewhere deep in the mist, the realization hit. The valley had tested us, the storm had tempered us, and the shadow of pursuit had forged a bond that was unbreakable. No matter the danger ahead, we had begun to understand the subtle dance of survival, not just together, but as equals, each reliant on the other, each strengthened by the trust that had grown from shared peril. The night was thicker than ever, the marshland around us swallowing sound and light alike. Every movement we made seemed amplified in the oppressive silence, and yet there was a rhythm to it, a rhythm we had learned to follow, silently, like predators and prey exchanging roles with each step. My fingers brushed against her shoulder, a signal, a reminder to stay close, to stay alert. She nodded subtly, her breath shallow, eyes scanning the shadows that flickered unnaturally in the sparse moonlight. We moved slowly along the treacherous path I had memorized, the soft mud threatening to give way beneath each step. The wind whispered through the gnarled branches above, carrying with it the distant murmur of our pursuers. They had realized our maneuver, of that I was certain. The way their shadows shifted in the fog, the faint glint of torches at the forest's edge, it was a calculated pressure, meant to corral us, to push us toward despair. I glanced at her, watching how she maneuvered the uneven terrain with a grace that belied exhaustion. Every muscle in her body was taut, eyes alert, and I could see the transformation that survival had carved into her. No longer the person who had trembled behind cabin walls, but a partner, an equal, a fighter forged in the crucible of relentless pursuit. I had expected fear to dominate her face, but instead there was determination, a hard-edged focus that mirrored my own. The marsh widened into a shallow basin, fog curling over its still waters like spectral fingers. Here I paused, listening to the echoes of the forest, the subtle shift of the fog, and the faint rustle of leaves that betrayed approaching movement. Our pursuers were clever, seasoned, but not invincible. They underestimated the terrain, underestimated us. "We need to split their focus," I whispered, crouching low behind a dense cluster of reeds. She leaned close, her ear almost brushing mine, absorbing every word. "Two decoys. We move in unpredictable patterns. Make them think we're panicking, and then we strike when they falter." Her eyes flickered with comprehension, a silent confirmation. No hesitation, no need for lengthy explanation. We had reached an unspoken understanding, the kind born of life and death necessity. I sent the first decoy, stones thrown into the reeds at opposite ends of the marsh, the splash echoing, drawing their attention. Immediately, the fog seemed to animate, silhouettes shifting toward the sound. I caught her hand, gripping tightly, and we dashed along a narrow ridge, careful to stay within the shadows, using the mist as a cloak. Their focus was fractured, their formation disrupted. Yet, for every tactical advantage, danger multiplied. A misstep could send us plunging into the mud, slow us down, and give them the upper hand. I could feel her heartbeat against my back, a rhythm racing with adrenaline. We moved like ghosts, silent, precise, aware that the next moment could decide everything. Then came the first confrontation. A figure broke from the fog, torchlight flickering across his face. I raised the rifle instinctively, breath steady, sight aligned. She moved alongside me, knife drawn, poised. The figure hesitated, realizing too late that we were prepared, that we had transformed the marsh into a trap. One shot rang out, low, deliberate, and he stumbled, disoriented, giving us just enough time to vanish into the thick undergrowth. The forest seemed alive now, every shadow a potential threat, every rustle a warning. Yet, despite the danger, there was clarity. Every step was deliberate, every breath calculated, every glance a conversation of survival. We had turned fear into strategy, panic into precision. Hours passed in this tense ballet, the fog shifting, obscuring, revealing. We forced our pursuers further into the marshlands, where the mud and water slowed them, where every misstep amplified our advantage. Her presence beside me was steadying, a constant reminder that we were not alone, that we were no longer prey but active orchestrators of the chase. By dawn, the fog began to lift, revealing the full scope of the marsh. Our pursuers were scattered, struggling against terrain, exhaustion, and the clever traps we had laid. I knew that the final confrontation was imminent. Somewhere beyond the trees, they would regroup, and we would have to face them directly. But this time, it would be on our terms. I crouched beside her at the edge of a narrow ridge overlooking the valley below. "We've bought time," I whispered, voice low, "but it ends soon. The final move, the confrontation. They'll come for us, all of them." She nodded, eyes scanning the horizon, knife ready, pack secured. There was no fear now, only focus, resolve, and the understanding that we were equal partners in the battle ahead. Every choice, every movement, every instinct had led us here, to the edge of confrontation. The valley was still, the mist curling over the forest floor like a slow-moving tide. And somewhere in that quiet, the pulse of inevitable conflict throbbed, a promise that the next hours would determine everything: survival, freedom, and the unbreakable bond forged through relentless pursuit. We exchanged a look, a silent pact, knowing that the coming moments would test every skill, every decision, every ounce of courage we had cultivated. The chase had transformed us, sharpened us, made us relentless. And now, at the edge of confrontation, I felt a strange exhilaration. Fear tempered into readiness, anticipation hardened into strategy, and survival distilled into a clear, uncompromising resolve. As the first light of dawn seeped through the mist, the shapes of our pursuers emerged, cautious, wary, but still intent on catching us. I tightened my grip on the rifle, feeling the familiar weight as both protection and promise. Beside me, she mirrored my readiness, every movement deliberate, every breath measured. We had been hunted, chased, tested, and now we would stand and we would fight. Because at the edge of confrontation, there was only one truth. Either we survived, together, or we didn't survive at all. The valley was alive with movement, the fog slowly lifting to reveal the figures that had stalked us for hours. Each one approached cautiously, aware now that we were not easy prey. I could feel the tension vibrating through the ground, through the air, as if the marsh itself were holding its breath. Beside me, she crouched low, eyes sharp, muscles coiled like springs ready to uncoil. I signaled, and we moved in synchrony, stepping from shadow to shadow, using the terrain to our advantage. The first of them stumbled into the trap we had set, mud sucking at boots, slowing progress. A shot rang out, precise, controlled, and then another, echoing off the distant ridge. The chaos we created was deliberate, each movement designed to disorient and divide. Her presence was steady, a quiet assurance that even in the storm of adrenaline and danger, we were united. She moved with a grace and determination that left no doubt. She had shed the fear that had once weighed her down. Now she was a partner, a force, unyielding and resolute. The remaining figures hesitated, realizing the terrain was against them, and their confidence faltered. We pressed forward, advancing strategically, every step measured, every breath deliberate. The final confrontation was near, and the stakes could not have been higher. And then they regrouped, faces hard with anger and fear alike, forming a line against us. I tightened my grip on the rifle, her hand brushing briefly against mine, a silent reminder that we faced this together. No words were needed. The bond forged through survival spoke louder than anything. The clash began with sudden intensity. Mud, rain, and the raw energy of determination collided in the valley. Each movement was decisive, every instinct tested, and through it all, we held our ground. Together, we turned fear into strength, pressure into precision, and desperation into resolve. By the time the storm cleared, their force had broken, scattered, leaving us standing amid the remnants of confrontation. Breathing hard, bodies tense, we looked at each other and knew it was over. Not just the fight, but the weight that had haunted her, that had pressed down on her life. Freedom was no longer a distant hope. It was here, tangible, earned through courage, strategy, and the unspoken connection that had grown in the shadows of pursuit. The dawn broke slowly over the valley, light spilling across the land like a promise. The air was crisp, washed clean by the storm that had passed, and the tension that had clung to every shadow now lifted. She stood at the edge of the cabin porch, shoulders relaxed for the first time in months, the borrowed neckerchief finally loosened around her neck. I watched her in silence, knowing that the world outside would never forget what had happened. But here, in this space we had carved from fear, she could begin again. She moved through the cabin with quiet assurance, sweeping the floor, stacking wood, arranging dishes, each motion deliberate, yet lighter than before. The work no longer carried the weight of obligation. It carried choice, a reclaiming of control. I could see it in her eyes, the flicker of laughter returning, the soft curve of a smile, the way her gaze lingered on the sunlight filtering through the windows. Outside, the past lay behind us like the distant ridge. No longer did the shadows of their cruelty reach here. The in-laws' threat had been real, but it had failed against the steadfastness of resolve and the certainty of justice. Every step we had taken, every risk, had built a path to safety, a path where freedom and dignity were no longer dreams but reality. We walked together to the edge of the pasture, the soft grass bending under our feet. The horizon stretched endlessly, a reminder that the world was wide and full of possibilities. Her hand brushed mine, a subtle touch that spoke of gratitude, trust, and a bond formed not through words but through shared survival. I did not speak. The silence was enough, the connection deeper than any declaration could be. The wind rose gently, carrying the scent of pine and earth, mingling with the faint traces of rain. In that quiet, ordinary moment, I realized that the most extraordinary things had happened. A life reclaimed, a spirit restored, and a trust that would not be broken. She turned to me then, eyes bright, the first clear recognition that she was no longer just surviving. She was living. Together, we looked back toward the cabin, toward the place that had become a sanctuary, and then forward to the open land. There was no fear in the distance now, only possibility. The past had its scars, but they were no longer chains. She breathed deeply, and I felt it too, the relief, the freedom, the promise of tomorrow. The story had begun in fear, in chains, and in the shadow of cruelty. But it ended in sunlight, in quiet victories, and in the unspoken certainty that even after darkness, life could be claimed, dignity restored, and bonds forged in fire could endure. The valley, the storm, the struggle, all of it now belonged to memory, a testament to what was survived, what was protected, and what had finally, irrevocably, been won. If you were in his place, would you have fought the same fight? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like the video, and explore the other videos waiting for you on the screen.